So welcome to the Classical Liberal Seminar. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Bruce Pardy is a professor of law at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. He is known for his expertise in environmental law, constitutional rights, and the rule of law. He has taught at law schools in Canada, United States, and New Zealand, practiced civil litigation in Toronto, and served as a mediator on the Ontario Environmental Review Tribunal. In addition to his academic work, he is the executive director of the Rights Probe, a think tank focused on law and liberty, and he's also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. So his writings and commentary explore the intersections of individual freedoms, property rights, and public policy. So welcome, Bruce.
Ivan, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you to you and Ken for setting me up. A pleasure to be with you, and thank you everyone for coming. I would like to take the time today basically to make an argument about things that you are probably already familiar with if you are classically liberally inclined. I have a few slides here that I'll refer to as I go along, so just give me a second, I'll set that up. Okay. So let's ask the basic question. Why free speech? Classical liberals, libertarians have a number of standard responses to this question. They include the following. Free speech is important in the search for truth, in the so-called marketplace of ideas. Free speech is important to protect and promote and maintain democracy. Speech is important for self-realization. I'm sure you're familiar with these, and this is not an exhaustive list. Of course, there are many more reasons that people give for having free speech, for insisting that speech must be free. And the argument that I want to make to you is this. Not that these ideas are wrong in and of themselves. I mean, speech, of course, is important, essential in the search for truth. Yes, democracy can't exist without free speech. And of course, yes, you can't realize yourself. You can't realize your potential. You can't think clearly without being able to speak. All of those things are true. The argument is this. These are not the best rationales, justifications for free speech. These are ideas, these are reasons that get us into trouble in the sense of inviting the notions that have the best chance of breaking free speech down. Now, I have a couple of quotes to ones you're probably familiar with. This one from John Stuart Mill on liberty. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. You understand the idea. You can't really understand the truth. You can't even understand your own side of things without hearing the other side. You can't know what the best arguments are unless you hear the arguments against them, and so on and so forth. This is the search for truth and the marketplace of ideas. A couple of quotes from courts, from the Supreme Court of Canada. The right of free expression of opinion and criticism essentially is so on and so forth, essential to the working of a parliamentary democracy. And from the Supreme Court of the United States, to permit the continued building of our politics and culture and to assure self-fulfillment of each individual, our people are guaranteed the right to express any thought free from government censorship. Any restriction on expressive activity because of its content would completely undercut the profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Now, if you read those and you think, well, what could be possibly wrong with those? They're true. These three ideas do not justify free speech in the way it ought to be justified, because they're based upon utility. In other words, free speech is justified when it has utility. But the trap is that means, by implication, that free speech is justified only when it has utility. Free speech is justified only when it has utility for the group, in other words, because utility is a group idea. Now, it's not entirely true. You can do your own utilitarian calculus, for sure, but We are talking about things that the authorities of the state, that is, the authorities of the group, like courts, will embrace in order to protect free speech. If the courts want to see what the good outcome is, if they protect free speech, then you are now playing in the sandbox of utility. And that means the effect of these arguments, the effect of these justifications, is to subordinate free speech to group utility. You've flipped the thing. You think you're defending the freedom, but you're actually justifying the priority of group utility. So let's go to the Bill of Rights. As you will well know, the Bill of Rights contains in a number of specific rights and freedoms: speech, religion, assembly, due process, equal protection, right to bear arms, and so on. Those are all very well, and it's a good thing they're in there. But the fact that they are in there in that form has led us to mischaracterize or misunderstand or proceed badly when it comes to possible infringements of these ideas. What I mean is this: liberty is a singular unitary thing, or at least that's the way it should be thought of. If you are free, you have freedom of speech. If you are free, you have freedom of religion. If you are free, you have freedom of assembly. If you have the right to bear arms, and so on and so forth. But because these things are specifically enumerated, we have come to think of them as specific and separate things, separate ideas, such that each one of these things requires its own justification. So let's ask this question instead. Why freedom? In other words, what is freedom for? Because that's the question we're asking about free speech. What is free speech for? What purpose is free speech supposed to serve? What purpose is freedom supposed to serve? And the point of asking these questions is to suggest that these questions are nonsensical. These are the wrong questions. Freedom does not have a purpose. Freedom is the purpose. It doesn't have a purpose in the group sense. The group is not there to decide what your freedom is for. That's for the individuals. So I'm not saying that freedom has no purpose. It has a purpose in the hands of individuals. And whatever those individuals, whatever those free individuals decide to do in their freedom, that is entirely up to them. It's not a kind of thing that I want a judge commenting or deciding upon what I'm going to do with my freedom. So, if freedom is the absence of coercion, if you ask why freedom, you are asking, why should we not coerce you? Give me a reason. Give me a justification why I should not coerce you, the state says. And then we come in and decide or offer these reasons why it shouldn't be done. Why free speech?
There is a question if you want to take it now.
Question, sure, why not? Rick, go ahead.
Rick, if you can turn on your camera, Rick, that would be great.
So just to be clear about the structure of your argument, the alternative, it seems to me, to the argument that free speech, for example, is in the service of something, which puts it into your domain of utility, I would have said that free speech and the academic free speech, you have freedoms to the extent that they are in the service of the mission of an academic institution, namely to the growth of knowledge, development of rational judgment. That for you is insufficient as a way of talking about the freedom. I would have said exactly what you said, that all freedoms are in the service of something, and they are granted to you in institutional context, and you have to define what the mission of the institution is, and then you understand what's permitted and what isn't permitted with regard to speech. What the alternative, at least I may be misreading you, is that you're saying it's an absolute value.
Yes. So I am saying that.
And therefore, for example, you have the absolute right to slander somebody.
Oh well, hold on.
Or
Yeah,
you
yeah.
the
So
okay.
yeah, not quite that, not quite that. But let me. It's a good question though. So let me approach it this way. I think we need to distinguish between two concepts: free speech, which is the right to speak without government censorship, and academic freedom, which is the right to speak and research and write and so on without the interference of an institution. And those two things are very similar, but they're also different. And they're different in this sense: the free speech that you have against the state is a right. And you described it, and I agree that it was an absolute kind of right. And I don't mean absolute in the sense that there are no limits on it, but it is not based upon a relationship that you have with your institution. That academic freedom you have is one that is negotiated, and in that context, yes, I think it is fair to say that the purposes that your academic freedom must serve are the purposes that the institution exists to deliver on. That's not unreasonable. But I'm not talking about academic freedom here. I'm
Well,
talking about
let's talk about the First Amendment in the United States.
yes, right,
All
right,
right.
right,
I mean, Robert Post would argue that similarly there is a mission that's implied by the granting of that liberty, and
right,
it is within one of the things you listed. It's basically to serve democratic citizenship
right,
so that opinions can be freely expressed, they can be robust. The state itself can't regulate them because the whole thing is to decide who the state's going to be. And so
right,
the citizens are granted that as in the service of democratic governance. If it
right.
wasn't a democracy, the freedom wouldn't be there. I mean,
Yes,
it's designed itself because
right,
it's a means ends relationship, which
right.
is
But
what you mean by utility, right?
yeah, exactly so, exactly so. So just to repeat myself, though, I am not denying that that is important and that that is true. You need free speech in order to have a democracy. There is utility in free speech, but the utility in free speech is not the reason it exists. In other words, if free speech is dependent upon having utility, now you are in real danger because you have flipped the default. Coercion now is the default. If you need to provide a justification, a utility justification for why certain kinds of speech should be protected, then you have said basically, show me to the state, show the state saying, show me why I should not coerce your speech right now. And you need an answer. And that to me is backwards.
I'm not sure why you think you need a default. Could you explain that a little bit? It seems to
Yeah,
me that in the academic context, you define the mission and then you decide what's within the scope of that mission. Of course,
right.
and I mean, when you say that there are limits on the absolute, that begins to sound like a contradiction in terms.
All right. Well, let me go on. Let
Yes,
me go on.
okay.
Let me go on. Let me go on.
All
Hold
right,
on.
okay, okay.
Okay. So here's what I mean by flipping the default. If, and it's a big if, of course, but if people are free in your country, that means they can speak without restrictions because they are free. Now, if you really want to, and there's going to be limits on free speech, I'll get to that in a minute. But if you want to ask a question, then ask the other question, the opposite question. For what reason can we coerce your speech? And then look for reasons. And there are going to be some. But that's the difference. You're going to have a default one way or the other. The default's either liberty or it's going to be coercion. And right now, without understanding that what we're doing, our default is coercion. That's the nature of the reasons that we give.
Okay, that's what I was asking. Why I said, why do we need a default at all? It seems to me that the system doesn't work on defaults. It works on trying to assess the relationship of means to ends,
Oh,
and that can go one way or the other.
yeah, okay. So because of that question, I'm gonna skip right to the end to something. Whoops, sorry, lost that. Okay. Here's what I mean by default. Let's go back to the Bill of Rights for a second. Your Constitution and ours, I mean, all Western constitutions are built in a certain way. They are built with a default. The default is this: the state can do anything except. That's the meaning of the Bill of Rights. Those rights in the Bill of Rights are set out as limits. In other words, the state can do anything except restrict your speech in certain circumstances, as interpreted by the Supreme Court.
I don't know about the Canadian case, but in the American case, we have enumerated powers. It's not the state can do anything. It's these are the limited number of things the state can do. That's part of what our Bill of Rights is about.
We might be using state in two different ways. When I say the state, I mean government. I mean both the federal and state governments, the executive branch, the legislature, and the courts altogether, all branches of the state. Those three branches together, there are checks and balances between them, but that's not what I'm talking about. The state as an institution, federal and state legislatures, executive, and courts, the default position in your Constitution is that power can do anything.
Only the enumerated powers.
Not true.
Well, look at our Constitution. Look at the Bill of Rights. You'll find it explicit. Here are the enumerated powers, and all the rest is reserved to the people or to the.
Yeah, sure. That's what it says. But the way your Bill of Rights works is that it exists in order to establish limits on what government is allowed to do. That's establishing a default. In other words, when you go in and say my right to free speech has been infringed, you have to show the infringement. In other words, if you don't show an infringement, the government can do what it's doing. That's a default.
Okay.
Imagine it flipped. Imagine the Constitution said something entirely different, said the opposite. It could have said this. It could have said the state, and I mean federal and state together, the state cannot coerce citizens except, and then you list the exceptions. That's the opposite default, because then now the coercion has to be justified. Right now the limitation has to be justified. Those are the competing defaults. And right now you have the default in the wrong way. And of course the American Constitution is the best one going. It's the gold standard, but it has that characteristic, and so do all the other ones. So let me back up to answer another question, which I was going to answer anyway, which is this. For what reason can the state coerce you? If you're thinking as a classical liberal. And the answer is, it can coerce you to prevent you from encroaching upon the freedoms of other people. And that defines, for me, in my opinion, that defines the justifiable limits on free speech. In other words, you can speak in any way you want as long as and until your speech is infringing the freedoms of other people, which is why, for example, you can't utter threats, because people have the right to be free from your coercive threats, which is why the laws of assault are perfectly reasonable. Maybe defamation, maybe privacy laws, maybe harassment, fraud. I mean, there are justifications for free speech that are constitutional and are justified. But the rationale for those limits on free speech is the freedom of other people. In other words, the one thing you can't do in exercising your freedom, if you believe in it, if you believe freedom is the absence of coercion, the one thing you cannot do with your freedom is coerce other people. And that, for some people, is the role of the state. The legitimate role of the state is to prevent you from coercing other people in order for all of us to be free. But that's not the way free speech works now. It works the other way. And what I mean by the other way, I mean the idea of group utility now is the favorite thing to encroach upon free speech. In other words, it is not in the interest of the group for you to speak in that way. And that argument is possible partly, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but partly because of the reasons that we give, classical liberals and libertarians give for having free speech. And those are utility arguments. It makes possible, for example, we'll go back to Hayek in a minute, the kind of thing that you may have You may know that John Kerry said a little while ago in September. He said, geez, we can't have this. If people only go to one source of information and the source they go to is sick, has an agenda, and that source is putting out disinformation. Our First Amendment stands as a major block to be able to, just hammer it out. It is part of our problem, the First Amendment, he said, particularly in democracies, in terms of building consensus around any issue. Democracies around the world are now struggling with the absence of a sort of truth arbiter. Now, note what's going on here. He is using democracy as a justification for curbing speech. And that has some weight now because we've been using democracy as a reason for having free speech. So, whatever, and the logic is, whatever protects democracy the best is the way it should go. And if curbing free speech promotes democracy, well, then the logic is you better curb free speech. Because we said, or implied, that democracy was the most important thing. Democracy, we said, is more important than free speech itself. And that is the mistake. I think, in my opinion, these justifications, as true as they are, as valid as they are not the reasons for having free speech. The reason for having free speech, simply put, is because you are a free person and you can say anything you want unless it infringes the freedom of other people to do the same. Any other reason is playing the game of group benefit. And the whole reason for having individual rights in the first place was to push against the idea that the group could decide what was right. And the rationales that we commonly give play right into that play. So maybe I'll pause there and see if there's more questions or conversations that we can have.
I have a question, Bruce. So to what extent what you're saying is sort of consistent with this idea that there are natural rights, namely rights that sort of exist prior to the state, right? Is that what you're trying to say here? Or?
Well, no. I mean, I'm of course very familiar with this natural rights argument, and philosophically, I agree. I mean, I'm inclined to that view. But when you come to the legal system, this is a very difficult argument to maintain, and I know it says reference to that in your Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But if you go to a court and say, Your Honor, I have natural rights; they've been infringed. Please, recognize them. Unless there's something else to go on to, a precedent or a statute or a provision in the Constitution, they're not going to do that. Which means that actually you're not pleading natural rights in the courtroom. You're pleading the other kinds of sources of law. So philosophically, I agree. Legally, it's just really not so.
Jonathan?
First, let me apologize for not having my video on. It's a long story, but
that's quite all right. No problem at all.
But let me take your argument to a logical conclusion, because I'm going to accept the fact that we have the right not to be coerced.
Right.
But then freedom of speech is only one piece. There are other ways the government coerces. I mean, for example, there are laws against suicide. So are you happy to extend this through everything?
Yes. Yes, I am. I think the general rule, if you like, the default position ought to be, if we are really free in a free country, then you can do anything you want as long as it does not coerce other people, does not interfere with other people, does not apply force to other people. If you want to kill yourself in a free country, then as far as I'm concerned, you go right ahead.
So, okay. By the way, you and I I'm very sympathetic to this, but let's take the devil's advocate.
Okay.
First of all, how are we going to deal with children?
Yes. But see, so children are always a problem with all of this, right? And people go to children when they want to show there's a problem. And of course, you have to have a different regime for children because they're not competent adults. Granted.
But what about the parents of the children? In other words, I wish to raise my kids in a particular way.
Yeah, yes, sure. This is going to be tricky. I don't deny that. But my position on these kinds of questions is this: if we can agree on the basic proposition first, like between adults, can we agree that between adults, forget the children for a minute, between adults, people can do what they want with their lives as long as they're interfering with other people? Let's try this. Let's say that there are two people inside a house, and the drapes are drawn, and they own the property, and they're in there, they're fully competent, and they've consented to doing whatever they're doing. Is there any justification that we can think of that would justify the state to come in and say, you can't do the following things inside that house? To my money, there's no children involved, there's nobody else involved, they're not coercing anybody. They can do anything in the world. I don't care what it is. I don't want to know. It's not my business. Did we lose Jonathan?
No, I agree with you.
Okay.
You and I are on the same page on this.
Right.
I'm not, yeah, but and so why do you think? I've always wondered, why does the U.S. Constitution not have a clause in it that says the state cannot regulate any action a citizen does that only affects himself?
Well, but I think because that's not the tradition we're actually working with. We are still actually, and of course, there's lots of different kinds of forces involved, and there's nothing is pure. But there is part of the constitutional tradition of the United States, as well as other countries, of course, but even in the United States, which is not actually about liberty. It is about authority. It is about having a common set of expectations, a common culture, and an expectation that the government actually does have unlimited authority other than those particular rights that are accepted.
Yeah, I think you're making some good points. It's interesting because the culture of the country isn't that way, right? The culture of the frontier, the culture of the government gets out of my life, I get to run my life this way.
Right.
Is not in accordance with that, right?
Right. But the culture of the frontier was not the only culture in existence, even at the time that the Constitution was put into place. Right. So you do have what I might call traditionally liberal and conservative elements or forces intertwined in the way the Constitution is constructed. And we are still dealing with that today. I mean, after all, some of the founders, as I understand it, their objection to British rule was that the king was not complying with British principles. I mean, they said, look, we are British, and you are not treating us as British. You are not giving us the rights that we have as Britons, and therefore either stop it or we're out. And the British tradition, although of course there are lots of similarities, but it's also quite different in some ways as well. I mean, the British tradition is based very much so on the authority of the crown, and the authority of the crown means the authority of those who know best. I'm not sure if John has a follow-up.
I agree with you. I don't want to dominate this conversation. I'm not sure.
Right. Okay, well let's go further afield. Let's see if somebody else has a thought.
Are there more questions?
Well, if there are no more questions, let me.
Yeah, go for it.
Extend it a little bit further.
Sure.
I'm here with a group of people, and it's astonishing. And these are very, very bright people. It's astonishing to me the extent to which they believe that evil people do evil things on purpose.
Right.
Understand that every human being thinks they're doing good when they're doing evil.
Yes. Okay. So
that's the basis of why we have to have these constraints.
100%. And here's one of my main complaints that go along with this free speech complaint about our rationales. So I have heard the following thing time and time again from people who are classical liberals, from libertarians, from conservatives. They say the following. They say, It's up to our leaders to honor the Constitution. It's up to our leaders to act ethically. Here's what I don't understand. Libertarians, classical liberals, are very good at acknowledging the reality of how the market works. Everybody will be familiar with Adam Smith's passage, the one that goes, it's not for the benevolence of the baker and the butcher that we get our dinner. It's to their regard to their self-interest. Okay? They've got no problem with that. But when they turn their attention to government, suddenly they expect rulers with power to not act in their own self-interest. I don't understand that. You just finished saying that people act in their own self-interest. The whole reason for having a constitution is because people with power act in their own self-interest. The Constitution is supposed to put limits on that power. And if your constitutional order depends on your rulers restraining themselves and honoring the Constitution and acting ethically, then your constitutional order does not work very well because it's not fulfilling its function. If rulers were ethical and wise and smart, we could just forget the Constitution, just give them power. And we know that doesn't work. So I don't understand the classical libertarian, conservative inclination to insist that our rulers need to honor the Constitution. If the Constitution does not require it to be honored, if it's possible to dishonor it, it's not well put together. Amy has a question. Hello,
Hi
Amy.
there.
Hi, very good to see you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Yes.
How are you?
Good, great.
I certainly appreciate your argument. I've been doing a reading group with students on fusionism, which of course has a strong libertarian component.
Of course. Yes.
And I see the argument that liberty is valuable in itself, freedom is valuable in itself. But my only worry about that argument is when it invokes the harm principle, because even those who are strong libertarians acknowledge that the limit of their position is when you harm other people. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is that we have seen the perversion and the abuse of the harm principle, the clever perversion and abuse of the harm principle, certainly in academia, but also in more broadly in democracy, that it has become psychologized and subjectivized.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So now it is the safetiest culture on campus asserts that when you say things that upset people or that offend them or that they see as traumatizing or, et cetera, that is a species of harm that justifies curbing what you say, and they extend it to, and this has been deployed against me, we can't learn from this person because we are so psychologically traumatized by being in a classroom with her and having to hear about, the technicalities of civil procedure from her that we're paralyzed. And then the parallel argument that because of some of the things she says, it is reasonable for us to expect that she will be biased against us and cannot be fair to us. So, it proliferates. It's like kudzu. So I guess I'm asking, and so that leads me in the direction of, excuse me for being so long-winded, that we do need our arguments from the creation of knowledge, the search for truth, the absolute necessity of tolerating dissent and loyal opposition in democracy, which I think is a very strong argument, frankly, and it's one the founders certainly understood, one that progressives have shunted aside for quite a while now. I think those are very powerful and strong arguments, which are sort of a backstop against this abuse of the harm principle.
Right. Oh, great. I'm very glad you've raised this. I do not believe in the harm principle. I don't believe harm is the right thing.
Just invoked it. You said
no, I did not.
If you harm other people.
No, that's not what I said. What I said was force, coercion. Coercion and harm are two different things. If you act to harm other people, let's take an example. It is not the case, and it should not be the case, that whenever you cause somebody harm, you should be liable. So So, for example, I can open a business for the purpose, in part, of putting a competitor out of business. Like I can open a shop next door to the person I'm competing with, and if I'm successful, I'll put him out of business to his detriment, cause him harm. Am I liable? Because I'm entitled to do that. So anything I'm entitled to do that does not coerce other people, that is with force or threats of force, as far as I'm concerned, is fair game. If it causes people emotional upset, I couldn't care less. If my speech causes them the kinds of upset that you're talking about, I don't think that matters one whit. But if I start to use my force against them, to coerce them either by threats or by actual application of violence, well then, okay, now there's a problem, because now they're not free. But my activity otherwise, my putting my competitor out of business did not make my competitor not free. He just didn't compete as well as me. And if you cause, for my money, if you cause harm in that way to other people, then that's just their hard luck. They have to act with their own freedoms to try and compete as best they can. So I have always thought that articulating the main principle of libertarianism or classical liberalism as the harm principle is wrong. I don't think that's correct. I think it's force that is really the thing that you cannot do.
Well, I mean, let me just add a couple of thoughts. First of all, the usual formulation is force or fraud. Right?
Sure,
You have
right.
to account for the fraud part, and
Right.
that's not that easy. The second is you are drawing a line here of you have to say what is coercive and what is not. So for the people who are psychologizing and subjectivizing, these concepts, harm, we can just reconfigure that as coercion. This is psychologically coercive, and they will do that. They will do that. So I don't think you're completely off the hook here.
Oh, you're quite right. You are quite right.
Yeah.
And this is not completely off the hook. No doubt about it. So we're both alluding to, but haven't actually targeted one of the problems here, which is that whatever the Constitution says or whatever the law says is a thing interpreted by courts, and so we are in their hands. I mean, the best example maybe is free speech itself. So if you have the First Amendment, what can you tell from the First Amendment just by reading the guarantee to free speech? I think that one thing you can tell is from those words that you don't really have free speech as imagined in the Constitution, because it's such a blunt statement that you know that there are some things that you can't do. So in other words, it's got internal limits that are not identified, and those internal limits will be defined by the courts, and therefore you're really in the court's hands. And the complaint that you're making is entirely justified, that we don't know how this is going to go. So it's one of the inherent difficulties with the way the Constitution and the legal system is designed. We are subject to the predilections and the preferences of judges, and we only have a certain number of ways to control who they are. So I grant you this is not off the hook. Yes.
David.
Hi, Bruce. David Henderson here. I'm a fellow Canadian. I think you're Canadian, from what I gather.
Sometimes I admit that in public.
So I'm sorry I missed the first 15 minutes because I was meeting with my CPA to minimize the amount of force the IRS is going to use against me.
Right.
You make a good point about how I'm a libertarian, about how we shouldn't. What I got, even though he didn't say it in these words, is that we just shouldn't sit back and expect the government to do the right thing. If that's what you're saying, I agree. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have an expectation. We should be more active. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have an expectation, because it gives us a bit of a moral claim against government officials who do the wrong thing. Would you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree with that at all. No.
But you're saying we need to go beyond that and don't be naive about what they're going to do.
Well, don't be naive, and don't feed into the trap. I mean, the trap. One of the traps for me is to justify our freedoms on utilitarian grounds.
Oh, okay.
Which can be flipped very easily by showing that the reverse actually provides more benefit to the group than the right that we're claiming. I think right.
Yeah, I kind of use both, right? the
Yep.
moral and the utilitarian, because like I'm an economist, and we economists have really strong arguments against tariffs, against price controls,
Sure.
against high marginal tax rates.
Sure.
And okay, well, another just a side thing, and then I'll get off the stage. But
Right.
I have a friend and colleague, Brian Kaplan, who's written a book in favor of open borders.
Yep.
One of the best parts of the book is that he takes 7 kind of philosophical bases, whether utilitarian, Christian, all these things, and shows how each of them leads to his conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very and it's not BS. I think he really makes his case, and I think
Right.
that's a very powerful way of arguing. And so I think, I'm not as nervous as you sound like about whether utilitarianism will lead us in the wrong direction.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. And I don't. And to be clear, I don't disagree with those arguments. I mean, they make sense in and of themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just that I am more nervous about basing. So what we're really doing here is or are in danger of doing is trying to establish a place where the group cannot go
Yes.
by appeasing the group.
Oh, okay.
And that means it's very weak.
No.
Right? That shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, no, that's right. And just one last thing, I'm sure you're familiar with Nextdoor, and you can get in all kinds of silly arguments. But there's this friend of mine on Nextdoor who
Yes.
made an argument for rent controls this morning, and she's a
Oh, yes.
friend. And
Right,
so I didn't use the standard economist thing. I said,
Right.
I think it's illegitimate for the government to get between two
Yes.
people making a voluntary contract. We'll see what she says, but I went with the moral case, which I don't normally do. Anyway,
Right.
thank you.
Right. No, but exactly so. So if someone can try to make a utility argument in favor of rent control,
Yeah.
like that's the danger. It's like, well, hold on. You just made a utility argument in favor of against them. So why can't I make a utility argument in favor of it? If my numbers work out, well, then we'll go with rent control. And in my universe, I don't care if it works out or not. Like
Yeah.
you can't do that. Sorry.
I'm quite confident it doesn't work out. That's the thing.
No, I understand that, but yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks.
Rick. Rick again. Rick Schroeder. You have to unmute yourself, Rick.
Can't hear you, Rick.
There we go.
There we go.
Just for the sake of argument, and it's quite possible that there's something I'm not understanding in your argument, but there
Okay.
are 2 parts of it that seem I'm having trouble putting together.
Okay.
On the one hand, we have freedom is the absence of constraint. We are each free persons or free individuals or free agent in some absolute sense of the term.
Uh-huh.
Then you say, anything I'm entitled to do, I can do. And you use that expression. That's how you put it. Anything I'm entitled to do, I can do.
Okay.
The entitlement part of it
Yeah.
strikes me as something that you can't bring in if you're holding to the first part of it, because the entitlement is always going to be an entitlement that comes from the institutional context and the missions of that institution. You can't go into Amy's law school class as a student and decide you're going to get up and start sloganizing about the war in Gaza.
Of
You're
course.
not entitled to do
No,
that because
that's
we
correct.
nor can Amy go ahead into a class of or anyone go into a chemistry class
Yeah.
and decide that they're going to start talking about the war in Gaza. And in fact, it seems to me that there's an argument to be made that it makes little sense to talk about you have free speech, you have freedom of expression, unless you fill it in with in the service of X, Y, or Z. That's always where your freedom comes from. And there are always entitlements involved because you are living in a social world, which is institutional, which has norms. And those norms are where your entitlement comes from in the first place. So how do you deal with the classroom situation I just
Yeah.
talked about?
Okay. So I hope very simply.
Because harm is not going to be invoked here, right?
Yeah, but okay. But when I'm talking about free speech, I am talking about speech vis-a-vis the government and the government only. I'm not talking about your right to engage in a conversation in somebody's house or in somebody's classroom, an institution's property. Property rights are part of this as well. right? So if
Why?
you own, right?
Okay, so
but hold on.
okay.
If you own property, then I have no right to go on your property and say anything that you don't want me to say. I'm not entitled. I have no right.
So where's the absolute freedom part of that?
The absolute freedom is with respect to the government and the government only. The government should not be able to restrain me unless I am restraining somebody else.
So why should your private university be allowed to?
Because the private university owns the property. The private university is a private actor. They can make any contracts or any deals, undertakings that they want to, just like you and me can, you and I can. If I have property, I can define who is on the property and who can say what on that property.
So, and how about at a public university? Are the examples I just different?
Right.
Can you do what I said in a classroom in a private in a public university?
No, but it does get muddier because now you've got the state involved, maybe.
Well, the state has created something for a purpose. It's a purposeful institution. It follows its purpose, even if it's public.
I understand that, and I work at one. But this university, and most of them have time, place, and manner rules, which makes sense. If you're in a classroom, you can't have everybody talking at the same time or talking about stuff that's not on the course and not the course is not about. But
of course
that's a different kind of thing than the government coming along and saying there's certain content that we will not allow you to speak. Right? I guess
what it seems to me to more fully present your position, you need to say a lot more about why you think the institution of the government is different than the norms that come with it, or any different from any other institution in our society where there are all sorts of entitlements and things you're not entitled to do. Well, why is the government so fundamentally different as an institution with its norms in relationship to citizens, as professors are in relationship to students, or as parents are in relationship to children, or as the conductor of an orchestra is with regard to the first violinist?
Okay, well, let's just use that last example for a short answer as to why.
Right.
Because the relationship between the conductor and the musicians is voluntary, it's consensual, it's negotiated. The relationship between the state and the individual is coerced. The state has monopoly on violence. That's why. Everything else, certainly every private institution, private individual, your relationships are voluntary. And you do not have the right to free speech or any other kind of constitutional right enforceable against any of the other private people in society. It is the state that you have rights against. It is the state with the monopoly of violence. It's the state we're concerned about.
Jeff?
If I'm understanding this right, you don't want to employ a utilitarian argument to justify free speech, but right. It seems like that's the most persuasive response to somebody making a utilitarian argument against free speech. Let's take, for example, the John Kerry quote you put up.
Right.
So you put up a quote where Kerry is arguing for the need to censor misinformation for the sake of democracy.
Right.
Are you saying your response to that argument would be freedom is more important than democracy?
Yes.
And that strikes me as a lot less persuasive than, I mean, you call it a trap to take on the utilitarian argument in response, but there is a very good utilitarian argument in response. There's a very good, the utilitarian argument for free speech support, being beneficial and necessary for democracy seems like the right response to the Kerry quote, and not, I think freedom is more important than democracy. That doesn't seem like an argument you're going to win with anyone who is, sympathetic to Kerry's point.
Well, but you see, if you're saying that we should make a political calculus as to what kind of argument might work for particular people, then okay, fair enough. I mean, sure, you're trying to win a political argument with people who are aligned against the idea of freedom, then okay, fine. That's a strategic choice. No problem. But that's not the point that I'm making. My point is that's not really what's going on. In our heads anyway, if you believe in freedom, you don't believe in utility. You don't believe that utility makes a difference about whether or not you should have the right to speak. And all I'm saying is we have to understand that ourselves. Let's not be tricked by our own arguments into thinking that that's the most important thing. I couldn't care less if my speech protects democracy or not. I'm a free person. As far as I'm concerned, I can say whatever I want for the sole reason that my thoughts are mine. I do not care if they're effective. I do not care if they're true. I do not care if they're respectful. They're mine. I'm a free person. I don't care what the consequences are. That's the real reason. Now, if we want to play politics with other people, then fair enough. That might be strategically appropriate. But that's not really what's happening.
I am sympathetic to that, but to simply put the utilitarian argument as playing politics, this is a strategic calculation for playing politics, rather than the primary persuasive way that we would argue in favor of this, I think is downplaying the importance of that.
Well, maybe so, but that's all part of the political calculus that you're doing, right? I mean, if you think that the other argument has no possibility of making any progress for anybody other than people inside this kind of a group, that's not an unfair conclusion. But I don't want us to pretend ourselves that utility is the reason we believe in freedom.
Well, there can be more than one reason.
Sure.
When you say the reason, you seem to think there has to be a hierarchy, and this is the number one reason, and other reasons are subordinate to that.
Well, I'm basically proposing. Maybe you don't agree with me, which is totally fine. But I am arguing that if you are, and maybe the labels are not appropriate either, but if you are what I regard to be either a classical liberal or libertarian, then your belief in freedom is not based upon a utilitarian calculus. Surely not.
That's not so obvious to me.
Okay.
Leave it at that.
Okay, Bruce, I wanted to, so feel free to ignore my question, but I was wondering whether your framework would help us understand this sort of controversial case of the Columbia graduate, right, who's being deported right now.
Yep.
And it's not a citizen. So yes. I was wondering whether the fact that this person is not a citizen sort of would mean that this idea that the state cannot coerce him would not apply, because he has the option to stay outside of the U.S., right? So the U.S. doesn't have the monopoly of force over him, right. And therefore I think the U.S. can decide on the deportation almost freely, based on my understanding of your argument. But I don't know if that's yes. You would agree with that.
I think you're right. So I don't want to get into the legal weeds, but I do think as a general proposition that all of those rights we're talking about, either real or aspirational, are owed or owned by citizens, and not everybody. You have to be a citizen in order to be able to claim the full protection of the Constitution. So yes, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think we're on the same page.
Okay, great. And just one last question, small last question. So, economists always invoke the idea of externalities to justify state coercion, right? So, I know you don't believe in externalities as a justification for state coercion, but would you be able to accept that at least under some conditions, and assuming the state has the burden of proof, externalities would justify coercion? If you can prove that these externalities are big enough, material enough, and that some coercion would be socially beneficial, would you accept that as a justification for state coercion, for restricting liberties in some way?
Well, how about this? Can you give us a concrete example of a kind of situation where you think it might be justified?
Well, I mean, some forms of taxation, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, let's take taxation. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a fan of taxation. I think that's coercion by force.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get into practical problems like, well, hold on. So how are you going to run a government without tax? And the answer is,
Mm-hmm.
well, I don't know exactly. But let's first acknowledge that what's happening. The state is coercing you with force and taking your money.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a fan of that. So I admit there are practicalities, but I don't want to assume too much too fast about the necessity for having a taxation system. There might be other choices that are more voluntary and not as coercive as the
Mm-hmm.
taxation system we have. So I don't want to give that away. I acknowledge the problems, but I'm not signing on to the taxation regime.
Okay. Jetson?
Yes, so this is somewhat going back to Yvonne's question about the student from Colombia, where he said,
Yeah.
but because he's not a citizen. So the same criteria that the US government is using to deport him, that essentially they equate criticism of the Israeli government with subverting the US. That's also a criteria that can be used to revoke citizenship of a naturalized citizen.
Right.
So if criticizing the Israeli government can warrant deporting somebody with a green card, as in the case of the Columbia student, would you say that same criterion could be used? Because again, it's almost identical verbiage to revoke citizenship of a naturalized citizen. Would that still apply? Because you said
Yeah.
it would apply to the green card holder. Would it apply to the naturalized citizen?
Yeah, that's a much stickier situation, right? Because you have somebody with citizenship status now, so they would be entitled, I would think, to all of the citizenship rights, including due process and all of those things. So I don't know the details of that regime, but I would have thought that those two people would be in different categories. And I'm not suggesting that the first person doesn't have any rights. But you just have to be more specific about, who they are, what status they have, and how they fit into the legal regime that is offered in the country to which they've come. So I would hesitate to answer your question in detail because I really don't know the
But in short, the
context.
government could revoke somebody's citizenship and then put them in the same category as
Sure, I understand that, but then you have questions about, whether that is appropriate constitutionally, whether it's possible, what the circumstances have to be, and I'm not knowledgeable about what those criteria actually are. I'd be a little bit more concerned about those than the first one, because now you are giving the state the ability to decide to take somebody out of the citizenship category. To whom can they not do that then? Is there anybody that they cannot decide to make new rules to take your
if
citizenship
you're
away?
born in the US, that's the only one that it can't be
Right.
reviewed.
Well, but maybe that's appropriate. I think this is more detailed than the principle requires. I understand that there are going to be, and this is always the case with the law. You're always going to get into nitty-gritty, and you're always going to be subject to the court's interpretation of what you've created. So I acknowledge the difficulty in the two cases you're comparing, no question. But I'm not sure that they erode the general principle.
Joy, and then Amy.
Hi, yes. Thanks for that, Bruce. I'm a little concerned about the deification of democracy, because it seems to me, and I don't know if you will agree or not,
Yep.
but it seems to me that democracy is a means to an end, that is, a flourishing society and so on.
Yep.
And democracy exists in many, many forms. So
Yes.
when you say democracy is great, just which one do you think is great?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, comments on that. That's my only question.
I totally agree with you. So this is the irony in a way. I agree with you that democracy is not the object. In a way, if you want to, talk about this claim about free speech and democracy, they're sort of backwards. I mean, maybe one of the purposes of democracy is to provide an environment in which free speech flourishes. Maybe. But I agree with you that democracy can be dangerous and democracy doesn't always work. And in a sense, let's just acknowledge that there is a great tension between some forms of democracy and individual rights. I mean, in a sense, individual rights can be said to exist in order to push back against democracy. In other words, the majority should not be able to say that you can't speak.
Which it would love to do, I think, much of the time.
I beg your pardon?
Which it would love to do much of the time.
Right. Oh, they would love to do. Absolutely true. So I have no desire to deify democracy. In fact, in many circumstances, I'm a great skeptic of democracy, especially if the potential for those kinds of events exist inside the system.
Amy.
Yeah, on the misinformation point, we have to save democracy by curbing misinformation.
Yeah.
I think that there are incredibly powerful utilitarian arguments against that position that are grounded in, the potential for abuse of power, who's going to decide what's in misinformation. I mean, that whole litany. So, I think that's very potent. Secondly, on the Khalil situation, here's what the Constitution says. It says Congress shall make no law respecting freedom of speech or of the press, and it doesn't say only with respect to citizens. I mean, there's a very good argument that this is a protection for natural persons and not just citizens, and I don't think it really resolves that. Now, you could make broader normative arguments about who ought to be protected by your position that, we're free people, you can't inhibit us, but I think these are up in the air, right? It doesn't follow, though, from the fact that Khalil's not entitled to protection and can be deported, which, I personally think is the right result, that you can strip a naturalized citizen of their citizenship and justify that, even if the law says so. So I think these are two completely separate issues, frankly, that, you don't need to resolve at the same time. My personal view is that I tend to be a First Amendment fundamentalist. I want to hear from anti-Semites. I want to hear what they're thinking and what they're saying. Yep. To me, the way to protect our culture, which has tamped down anti-Semitism, and we've been working on that for many hundreds of years, and it's, I think, very important and essential, is at the border. I've long taken the position that we should let very few, if any, people in from cultures that are very foreign to our own. And frankly, I have to say it, Arab and Muslim culture is extremely anti-Semitic. It's at the centerpiece of their belief system, and I don't see why we have to commit suicide by letting or undermine our fundamentals by letting people in from those places. But once they're here, if they're going to be a part of our polity, we want to hear from them.
Oh, I agree.
That's just my take on it.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you. And of course, the easy case for who has rights to what is, well, I mean, not everybody would agree with this, but I think somebody who is on the other side of the border and not been let in yet really has no claim to any American rights at all. Right. So I agree with what you said, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. I think we don't have more questions. Is there any other question? No, I think that's all. Okay. So thank you very much, Bruce. This was great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.